All right, Hosea chapter 10. We're going to conclude our study of these of Hosea chapters 9 and 10 tonight. And as we've been studying, we are looking at a description of Israel's punishment that was brought about by God due to her sins. And we have looked at these two chapters under the key phrase of do not rejoice, based on the phrase found in chapter 9, verse number 1, when God told Israel to rejoice not. And these two chapters serve as explanation for that opening phrase there in chapter 9. And thus far in chapter 10, we have studied the fact that Israel's sin has found them out, verses 1 and 2. That because their sin had found them out and because punishment was going to be brought to bear on them, they were going to experience nothing but sorrow and shame, according to verses 3 through 6. And not only sorrow and shame would be what they experienced, they would also experience great suffering in light of verses 7 and 8. And so tonight we begin with verses 9 through 11. And we're going to see here that Israel is not to rejoice, for the sentence of judgment is going to be executed against them. And if someone would, read these three verses for us. Hosea chapter 10, verses 9 through 11. Who has that?
O Israel, you have sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. When it's my desire, I will chasten them. People shall be gathered against them when I bind them for the two transgressions. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain. But I harness her fair neck, I will make Ephraim pull plow. Judah shall plow. Jacob shall break his flocks.
Thank you, Brother Keith. And so here we have, again, we're going to see in verse number 9, Hosea pulling upon Israel's history. And here verse 9 serves as a reminder to them. And the prophet is referencing an event from Israel's history. And we know this from the phrase that they had sinned from the days of Gibeah. The event here under consideration is found in Judges chapter 19. I believe I have it on the handout, do I not? Judges chapter 19, I do. So just a brief overview of that. We won't discuss it, obviously, but I want to give you the overview. And it regarded the wife of a Levite. And in this incident, the men of Gibeah assaulted and slew this woman. And the battle which followed did not destroy all the sinners from the nation. Rather, the evil that occurred in this day resulted in the near destruction of the tribe of Benjamin. In fact, only 600 Benjamites remained after the fighting. And the fighting resulted when the woman was abused by the sons of Belial at Gibeah, and the Benjamites would not turn them over to the nation for proper punishment. Eventually, as has been pointed out, Israel triumphed. They eventually won the day. The real problem, though, remained after this event, and that was the disposition on the part of Israel to rebel against God's will. And so, that event, Hosea's pulling on that event to speak to Israel of their constant history of rebelling against God. And so he's alluding to an event that they would be very familiar with, that their forefathers would have passed down to them, since this occurred several hundred years prior to the words to Hosea's prophetic work. Now look at verses 10 and 11 with that event in mind. Here we have God's discipline of Israel. Look at verse number 10, the time frame. When it is in my desire, the ASV has, when it is my desire. Now, why would God say it is his desire? Does God take pleasure in punishing people? We know that he doesn't. But why would God say, it is my desire, or when it is my desire? What does that mean to you?
He's in control.
He's in control. That this is going to happen on my time frame. I'm pronouncing punishment on you, but it's not going to happen until I say it's going to happen. I think you've got it. You hit the nail on the head, Brother Ricky. In other words, it's going to occur at the best time. It's going to occur at God's time. Now, does God's timetable always... does God work on the same timetable that we do as human beings? No. You know, Peter tells us that a day is like 1,000 years unto God, and 1,000 years is like unto a day in 2 Peter chapter 3. So we cannot presume that God's going to do things when we want Him to do things. He works on His own time, not ours. But we can be certain that this time was to come, just as we can be certain that Christ is coming again and that we are going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ come Judgment Day. We can be certain those events are going to come. Now look at the latter portion of this verse. So God says, I'm going to discipline my people, and the people shall be gathered against them. And again, the people here would be the heathen nations, and in particular, the Assyrians. And again, God would use them as His instrument to effect this punishment. Now, this would occur when Israel had bound herself up in... The King James has 2 furrows, but Brother Keith... But the ASV and other translations render it 2 transgressions. Now, we might ask, what are these 2 transgressions? What would be these 2 transgressions? Or what would God point this out? Or we might ask, what's significant about this? I thought all sin was sin and all sin is transgression. Not all sin makes one guilty in the sight of God. Why say these 2 transgressions? Let's think about that for a moment. Any ideas? I have a couple in mind. I want to see if we can... Anything, Susan? I can see the wheels turning in your head. Anything? All right. In my study here, most likely, and again, I'm not saying this is definitive, most likely, and probably, plausibly, let's put it that way, quite plausibly, the first transgression under consideration is their rejection of God as their king when they demanded the king to be like the nations round about them. Remember what God told Samuel there in 1 Samuel 8? God told Samuel, they haven't rejected you. Who did Israel reject? They rejected God. Why? How did they reject God? What did they want? A king like the nations. They wanted to be like the world. They wanted to be like the world round about them. And so what happens? What is the consequence when God's people, and there's the application for us today as Christians, what happens when God's people want to be like the nations round about them?
Displease God.
Displease God. And so we are conforming to the worldly. We would be conforming to the worldly standard, would we not, when we want to be like the world? Rather than conforming to the image of Christ, conforming to God's will. And the second transgression, perhaps, and possibly, again, let me emphasize this. This is perhaps and possibly. I'm not saying this is definitive. I am saying that this is possible and a plausible explanation for this. Is that the second transgression would be the rejection of God as their God when they introduced idolatry. And anyone remember who introduced idolatry into the land? Jeroboam. There you go, Sister Dusty. Jeroboam and its attending practices. And again, we know and we understand that Israel's problem of idolatry went all the way back to Sinai. We understand that. But this is dealing with in particular after they had entered the land. And certainly idolatry gave them fits when it was introduced into Israel. Susan?
Are you talking about idolatry as a nation? Or because they kept having little bits of idolatry when they would not do like God said when they captured the land. And they'd taken on some of those customs.
Right.
So are Are you talking about as a whole when they went towards worshiping, or?
Well, you could see the problem. You could see the wholesale problem developing there in the days of Judges. But until Jeroboam, we do not read about about there being any golden calves or any such thing in Israel, or that caused the nation to stumble. Now, did Solomon go after idols? Absolutely. But do we read anywhere in the historical account, where Solomon caused the people to sin with these idols? I may be wrong on this.
Well, Aaron.
He was criticized on it for having the high places and stuff that
Yes.
allowed the people
Mm-hmm.
to be led away with his.
And certainly. But Jeroboam's was even more malicious.
Jeroboam made the places for him to worship the idols. He designated.
Exactly. And he designated, exactly, Sister Dusty, that these are the gods that brought your forefathers out of Egypt. In fact, Jeroboam, if you read there in 1 Kings 12, he even changed the priesthood. So that's why I think we can appeal to that event as this tipping point. That's not, again, as we pointed out, Susan, that's not to say Israel hadn't engaged in idolatry prior to that. And we see that at Sinai. We see a little bit of it in the days of the Judges, and we see it creeping more in with Solomon. But certainly, I would suggest that Jeroboam really exploded under the reign of Jeroboam. Would that be perhaps a correct assessment?
Probably so, but it wasn't limited to the northern kingdom.
No, obviously. Southern kingdom, they had just as many problems with idols. And in fact, let's ask this question. Why did the southern kingdom last longer than the northern kingdom?
They had more righteous kings.
There you go, Brother Keith. How many righteous kings did the northern kingdom have?
None, did they?
El Zippo. In fact, to the south, even though God is going to prophesy against Judah in this context, to the south now, during this time of Hosea, you still, when you study Hebrew history, you still have a couple of good righteous kings yet to come to the throne in Judah. Because shortly after Israel falls, the northern kingdom falls, Hezekiah comes to the throne, and he was a very righteous king. In fact, when Hezekiah fell ill, what did he do? Anyone remember?
Prayed to God.
He prayed to God, and what did God do?
God extended his life 15 years.
God extended his life. God heard his prayer. And so Hezekiah was a very righteous king. He wanted to do what was right. Now, his son Manasseh came to the throne, reigned 55 years. Well, he undid everything Hezekiah did. So did Ammon. But even after those two wicked kings, you had Josiah. Now, God had pronounced that Judah was going to fall, but he told Josiah specifically, because Josiah was faithful to God, he was tenderhearted, and he restored the temple. Well, you won't see the destruction I bring upon Judah in your days. God promised Josiah he would go to his grave without seeing the destruction that would come upon Judah. And Josiah worked alongside Jeremiah for a time, and Josiah did his best to bring about, to rid Judah of idols. And
What did Hezekiah did something, that made him sick, because that's when he had to pray God to extend his life, or pray God not to take his life. He had done something because God was mad at him, wasn't he?
no, it wasn't until... No, Hezekiah, he just fell sick. Now, God did get aggravated with Hezekiah when the Babylonians heard of his recovery. They came and Hezekiah foolishly showed him everything he owned.
What have they seen in that?
Yeah, what have they seen? Oh, you could preach. I have preached a sermon. I think every faithful gospel preacher has preached a sermon on that verse, especially as it relates to the home. What have they seen in thy house? And of course, Hezekiah told him, well, everything. Now, that was just a blunder by Hezekiah. That was just a moment. I guess you could say he just did something very stupid in showing the Babylonians everything. And he got called on it. Again, that, it just shows us he wasn't perfect. He was righteous, but not perfect. And so that's the difference why Judah lasted as long as she did. It's because they at least had a glimpse of righteousness, whereas the northern kingdom, as long as the northern kingdom did not. And again, I think we can pinpoint a lot of the problems to the northern kingdom. And I guess, it really could go back to Solomon, when he foolishly allowed his concubines and wives to lead his heart away. And then, of course, his son Rehoboam did not listen to wise counsel. And so we're seeing here the price they're going to pay. Now look at verse 11. Here we have the yoking here. Again, here's some agricultural metaphors used here. Ephraim is a heifer that is taught. In other words, Israel's like a young cow that is taught to thresh or tread out the grain on the threshing floor. And she did willingly because of the advantage to self and the benefits that she would receive. And again, under the law of Moses, in fact, Deuteronomy 25 verse 4 taught that the oxen that treadeth out the corn should not be muzzled, and thus could eat while doing the work. And again, the point here is Israel loved to do what profited her. But did that willingness carry over to the spiritual realm as it relates to God's will? She didn't like to do that. What did Israel do instead when it came to God and His will for Israel? She ignored it. And isn't that the problem today, that a lot of people ignore God's will for their life? And what causes people to ignore God's will? What causes people to ignore this word?
I want what I want.
Yeah. I want what I want. And again, it's, that mindset's an age-old mentality, is it not? Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. And again, isn't that what resulted in Adam and Eve sinning in the garden? I want what I want. I want to eat of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. I don't care what God has said. It looks good to my eyes, and I'm pretty sure it's a pretty tree, and I'm sure it tastes pretty good too.
His wife would be like.
Yeah. He did. Eve listened to the serpent, and then did Adam have to sin as well? Neither one of them had to sin. They didn't have to sin. But they listened to the wrong fella. They listened to the serpent. Eve listened first, and then Eve enticed Adam. Well, he followed along with her, and they both fell into sin.
I have for a great many years helped young people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the important lessons that I try to teach them is that the individual that you choose to be your mate, be your husband or your wife, is going to have a great deal of influence on you and a great deal of influence on where you spend eternity.
Oh, no doubt. Indeed.
Adam was not deceived.
Mm-hmm. Eve was deceived.
But he partook of the fruit anyway. Why do you think he did that?
Remember, Paul says that Eve was deceived there in 1 Timothy chapter 2.
And Eve ate. And so at that point in time, her eyes would have been opened and Adam's would not have been until he ate.
Right.
So he probably saw, maybe she demonstrated in some way how this had made
Perhaps.
his heart or whatever that made him want to be like her then.
Perhaps.
Solomon.
Yep, that's what I was going to say.
Wisest man that ever lived. And yet, he allowed his wives to lead him away from God.
Mm-hmm. And concubines. And again, he finally wised up. You think about the book of Ecclesiastes. That's one of the most fascinating and I would say one of the most important books, but it's also one of the most miserable books in the Bible, is it not, when you think about why Solomon wrote it? Here you have a guy who wasted his life in idolatry and all sorts of other vices. And here you have him coming to the conclusion in life that everything is worthless separate and apart from God. It makes you wonder, what took you so long, Solomon? You're the wisest. God gave you wisdom, and you're only now coming to this matter. We need to listen. Mankind would do well to listen to Solomon in this regard, would he not? What did Solomon say was the whole of man? Fear God, keep His commandments. And certainly that, I firmly believe Ecclesiastes was written near the end of Solomon's life. And certainly it would indicate that perhaps he had a change of heart and repented of his sins, just based on the purpose of that book and the nature of that book. And certainly it shows to us the futility of living a life without God. And certainly Israel exemplifies it here. And when she refused to do God's will. And certainly this situation would be rectified by God. We're told here in verse number 11 that he would put a heavy yoke upon her neck, and a rider would drive her, since she would not submit to the light and easy yoke of servitude to God. And this would happen when Israel was carried away into captivity by the Assyrians. Now, I think it's also important to note as well, Judah is included in this pronunciation, and we've already mentioned Judah earlier. Again, she would eventually follow Israel into captivity, and certainly both nations would do the hard labor of slaves as plowing and harrowing the sod in the field of their enemies. And this is just a glimpse of the suffering they would experience as a result of God's righteous judgment. However, we understand that God would spare a remnant from Judah that would return to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the walls. And we read this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So God says, you don't need to rejoice, because I'm going to pour out judgment upon you. Now, verses 12 through 15. Again, we're coming back to God's law of sowing and reaping. In other words, God is telling Israel, you don't rejoice, for you are going to reap what you have sown. And so let's look at verses 12 through 15. If someone would read these verses for us.
Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground. For it is time to seek the Lord till he come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed wickedness, you have reaped iniquity, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because thou dost trust in thy ways, and in the multitude of thy mighty men.
Go ahead and read down through verse 15.
Therefore shall a tumult arise among the people, and all the fortresses shall be spoiled, as Shalman spoiled Beth Arbel in the day of battle. The mother was dashed in pieces upon her children. So shall Bethel do unto you because of your great wickedness. In a morning shall the king of Israel utterly be cut off.
All right, thank you, Sister Dusty. Again, look at verse number 12. Here we have a plea and another glimpse into God's law of sowing and reaping. Remember what God had earlier said, that Israel had sown unto themselves the whirlwind and would reap the whirlwind? That's in the negative standpoint. Now what's God telling them to sow here?
So I think God is telling them they've still got a chance.
Yeah.
If they're willing to repent and come back to Him.
Yeah, so
you still got a chance.
Sow righteousness, reap mercy. And I think that's a key, because you come to chapter 14 when we get here, and what's God going to plead with Israel to do? Return unto me. You see, as we look at this book, there's a lot of judgment, a lot of scenes, and a lot of glimpses of God's pronounced judgment. But we also see mercy pronounced. Mercy, glimpses of mercy. God giving Israel opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to repent. In chapter 11, when we begin it next week, we're going to see God's great love for Israel. And, chapter 11 is one of my favorite chapters in the book. It really presents to us a marvelous picture of the love God has, especially toward His people. And so again, as Brother Keith pointed out, here God is pleading with them, you get your act together, turn back to me, sow righteousness, and in turn, you're going to reap mercy. And this mercy would come from whom? God, who is rich in mercy. And again, here we see God's willingness to forgive. And God's calling for them to return to Him and their true work as His people. And He had placed them in the land to be a lot of goodness and righteousness. And they needed to return. And it was indeed time for them to return to seek the Lord. And if they did, and if they returned, God would bless them once again. But it was their obligation to do what? What was incumbent upon Israel here? To repent. To turn back, to repent. and do his will once more. Now, verse 13, when we look at it, here is the reason for the instruction of verse number 12. Ye have plowed, or we might say, they had sown wickedness, and as a result they reaped what? Iniquity. In their current state, they were sowing or plowing with wickedness, and consequently reaped lawlessness because they had trusted in their own way, did they not? But what has God said? It is not in man that walketh to do what? To direct his own steps. Yet here Israel had attempted to do such. And certainly their way produced fruit unfit for consumption. It produced rotten fruit or wild fruit. Verses 14 and 15, we've seen the plea, we've seen the plowing. Now here's the provocation. Verse 14, we see the war. Here we have a glimpse of if they did not repent, there would be a tumult that rose. And this would be the result of the Assyrians marching into and through the land. And when they arrived, the fortress cities of Israel would be destroyed and left desolate. Now the individual here, Shalman here, probably refers to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. Quite possibly and plausibly, it's a shortened form of Shalmaneser. And the occasion of the destruction of Beth Arbel is unknown. We do not know when it occurred, and there's little historical evidence that we know of that deals with it. Whenever or wherever it occurred is unknown to us, but the incident was terrible and would be one in which Israel was well familiar with, as would be the cruelty of Assyria, who took pity on neither infant nor mother. Again, the last phrase, the mother was dashed in pieces upon her children, certainly indicates that. And certainly this indicates the severity of the punishment and certainly the consequences that sin brings. So, verse number 15, we see the wasting. Again, so as Bethel. Now, what did the word Bethel mean? What does the term Bethel mean? We've talked about this before, and let's refresh our minds yet again as we close this chapter. The location of Bethel, what was the meaning of the name? Anyone remember? House of God. Now, the name changed because it was no longer the house of God, because Jeroboam had set up idols there at Dan and Bethel. And so it became Bethaven. And anyone remember the meaning of the name Bethaven? House of vanity. And certainly that was a more appropriate name due to it being the seat of their idolatry. And so here we see that God through Hosea is saying that Bethel is going to be the cause of your doom. And the reason being we might call it the capital city of Israel's idolatry. Could we not, I guess I'll ask you this, Sister Dusty, would that not be an appropriate term to make of Bethel or Bethaven as being their capital city for their idolatrous conduct? Since Jeroboam had erected the idols there as well as at Dan.
They had made that a good place to stay at to go to work.
Indeed. Rather than going to Jerusalem. And remember, that's one reason why Jeroboam set them up there. He didn't want the people going where? He didn't want them going back to Jerusalem. Now, why did he not?
Oh, well, if they did that, before long, they'll just go back to, I don't want to be king anymore.
There you go. So we see a lot of this, the problem of idolatry that's exploded in the land was due to selfish reasons on the part of Jeroboam, was it not? He didn't want to lose his power.
Jeroboam apparently didn't believe in anything, really and truly, except his own power.
Yep.
And it wasn't like, I'm devoted to this idol here. No. This idol was a means to an end.
It was. To establish himself and his seed upon the throne of Israel. So he knew how to work things And he certainly didn't believe in God, even though it was God who told him that I'm going to give you the kingdom. And yet look how that turned out. He rejected God, and even then he thought he did everything by his own power. But by his actions of idolatry, introducing it there at Bethel, would ultimately cause the doom of the nation. And so at daybreak, or at what appeared to be the dawning of a bright and better day for Israel, it would come the destruction of the nation in the form of the Assyrians. And God would utterly cut off Israel's king, and Israel as a kingdom would be no more.
Well, have we been studying all this time? Am I totally wrong? But have we not said a lot of times that no matter what they did, that it was pronounced in the end on them that God was tired of fooling with them?
Mm-hmm.
They were going to go to Assyria no matter what they did.
Yeah.
Is that not what we've been saying?
Mm-hmm. That's what we've been saying.
So, in that case, there was no way they could reverse that at this point, was it?
I believe it was.
I believe I think there was. Even though, God said, now let's, like you just said, Brother Keith, God said, I'm going to do this. But he's also saying, but if you repent, if you sow righteousness, you shall reap mercy. Before the actual invaders came, there was still that time, that little window, we might say, by which Israel could avert disaster. In fact, even in the South, remember in our study of Jeremiah, God told Jeremiah, it could also be like this as well. It could be that if you do right, if you serve righteousness, I'll show you mercy. You won't be destroyed you won't be destroyed. Your life won't be taken. You can go into captivity if you but surrender your will to God. If you surrender your will to me, I'll let you live. Even though Assyria may take the land, you can live. Remember, God told Zedekiah and the rest of the inhabitants of Judah, you need to surrender to the Babylonians. Surrender, submit, and live. Go into captivity peacefully and quietly and live, or else resist and die. And that could also be, Sister Dusty, what we're dealing with here. Either explanation fits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but if we've been saying that, we shouldn't have been saying that it was no matter what they did.
Right. And again, we're all learning, and again, I'm not perfect, There's a lot we can't know. There's a lot we can know about God's judgments, and there's certainly a lot we can learn about that here, in whether or not they're final or not. And well, obviously they are, and so there are times we may say things that are erroneous, and for that I'll gladly repent and apologize if I ever teach anything.
But I was under the assumption that he had told him, you've done this, gone away and come back, and gone away and come back, and every time you come back you get worse. And there'll be no coming back. You're going to face this judgment no matter what you do. Assyria is going to take you.
Mm-hmm. And so, in that case, Hosea chapter 10, verse, what we talked about there in verse 12 would imply that if they surrendered, they would live. That would show mercy, would it not? If they just came out and said, we surrender, that could be the case. But again, we're also going to have to deal with chapter 14 as well in all of this. Because we're also going to have to deal with God's plea here to Hosea in chapter 14 to return unto God. And so we have to, we're going to have to, that has to be explained in light of that. And we'll try to tie all the loose ends, and we'll try to tie all these loose ends together as we go throughout these remaining chapters. But certainly chapter 11 is going to give us a picture of God's love out of this picture of the fact that judgment was coming. Judgment loomed and that destruction was going to arise. And due to their failure to repent. Now, could it also be the case that God knew they wouldn't repent? I would say, yeah. So that also ties together in that regard as well. In any case, I think we get the picture that there is no joy to be found in a life that's lived separate and apart from God. Israel would find that out. And so, when God tells men not to rejoice, man had better listen. And Israel should have listened to God, but their problem was they didn't listen. And so as human beings today, there's a reason why we have the Old Testament and why it's written for our learning, so we can learn what not to do. And so let's learn not to follow the example of Israel.